one thing I want to do before I progress any further is to loosen this camshaft sprocket bolt. It's probably going to be pretty tight. I think when you tighten it, it's supposed to be around 81 foot-pounds. But we need to take advantage of some things so we can get that off. And what I'm going to do is, if you can look through there, you can see there's the head of a bolt back in there. I'm going to take advantage of that as a means of holding the sprocket so I can loosen this sprocket bolt. So I'm going to turn the crankshaft just a little bit so I can clear the head of that bolt. So we're a little past top dead center, but now I can take advantage of that bolt that's in there. So now what I can do is I can take a socket, put it on that bolt back in there, and then take my breaker bar, put it on the sprocket bolt, back it off until the socket hits the splines of the sprocket, and break it loose. And that was pretty tight. There we go. Now before I forget, I'm going to rotate the engine back to top dead center. Now we can go ahead and remove the bolt. See if we can slide off the sprocket with the timing belt. And there's your sprocket. You can see it's marked with an R there. That would be for right, or the right hand side of the engine, the passenger side. There's also a little keyway. That keyway lines up with that little metal pin that's sticking out. That little pin's called a knock pin. Let's go ahead and pull that out too, just to make sure we don't lose it. Let's remove the other sprocket. And the knock pin. Now we won't be able to take the timing belt all the way because we have not removed the lower timing belt cover or the crankshaft pulley, and so the belt's going to be trapped down there on the drive shaft. So what I can do is I can just pull this belt back, clamp it down here onto that pulley, and I'll just leave that hanging over here. Eventually we're going to want to remove this the metal portion of the timing belt cover, so we need to remove this idler. Use my breaker bar to make it easier. It wasn't too tight after all. That bearing feels really good on mine. I'm going to remove the alternator. Start by pulling the electrical connector off the back. And this other electrical connector, which is held on by a nut, I can remove the lower bolt that goes through the tension adjuster. Dropped it. So there's the tension adjuster. It had two washers on it. One behind and one in front of the slot. Put the nut back on it to keep it. Then I can remove the upper bolt. And remove the alternator from its bracket. Part of this wiring harness is held on by a little clip in a hole. Let's see if I can pull that out. There's a bracket here. It's called the input chamber stay, and it holds up this side of the intake. It supports it, and it's held on by 2 bolts, one up here in the intake and one way down here that goes in the cylinder head. I got to remove some electrical connectors before we can remove the intake, or at least the top of the intake. First one back here is the VSV for fuel pressure. The VSV stands for vacuum switching valve, and there's that orange electrical connector right there that comes off. Here's your throttle plate in there. And here is the throttle position sensor. We need to remove that electrical connector. And one last electrical connector here just below the throttle opening. That VSV that we disconnected back in the back there, I believe is for fuel pressure control. There's one more VSV right here on the front of the engine, and it may be for EGR. I'm not sure, but we'll disconnect that one. Looks like it's controlling some vacuum going into the intake. Now we got various hoses to remove. The first one is a PCV hose right here. You might notice I put a blue dot on here. Now, this is not going to be a hard one to remember, but various places across the engine and these hoses and electrical connectors, I put some colored dots. You'll see more of those shortly. You remove this little clamp. Slide off the hose. Back here again below the throttle plate, we got 2 hoses. You might see I put a red mark on that one and a white mark on this one, and also on the body of the throttle, below the throttle plate. Just remove these clamps. One more hose just below that one. It's right there. This one is an air hose from the power steering pump, and it's labeled in lovely purple. Over here is the evap canister, and there's a hose that goes up to the top of the intake. I can remove that hose clamp. A little twist breaks it free. We should be able to pull it off. Next to that evap hose is another PCV hose in lovely metallic green. And a vacuum line. This is a vacuum line to the VSV. Another one in purple. That last one came off the back of the VSV and went down to the fuel pressure regulator. There's another one that comes out of the bottom of that VSV. Comes down right here, and it goes into the back of the intake. Let's see if I can pull that off. Sorry about the shaky camera work. Ah, it came off right there. So I think I figured out what this is here now. This is the idle up valve, and it has a vacuum line going from it up to the upper intake. I'll remove this diagnostic data port from its mount. Just pull the little tab back and slip it up off of that mount there and let it just hang down there for now. Alright, now we're ready to remove the upper air intake chamber. It's held on by 4 bolts, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 nuts. 1, 2 here. Start by removing the nuts. Now the 4 bolts. There's the metal gasket between the upper and lower portions of the intake manifold. I'm just going to leave that in place so I don't disturb it. Alright, now we're ready to remove the lower portion of the intake. There's a bolt back here, and that bolt holds up the back part of the wiring harness that goes up here toward the fuel injectors and other things, so we need to remove that bolt. Here, looking from the driver's side, there's a fuel return hose right here, and it's attached to the intake with 2 brackets. The bolts go through those brackets, one here and one here. As I've been doing all along, I'm going to put the bolts back in the holes where they came from, just to keep them straight. This is the brake booster vacuum hose. And this is the ground strap. Okay, we're ready to remove the lower part of the intake now. It's held on by 3 bolts, 1 up here on top and 2 down here below, as well as 2 nuts, 1 here and 1 likewise right back there. Looks like the lower gasket stayed on this piece. We'll just keep that together. So we need to get a lot of the main wiring harness off the top of the engine. And I'm going to start that process by unclipping the electrical connectors that go to the fuel injectors. I'm going to remove this bolt that secures it to this side. Looks like I can also remove the connectors to the coil packs. There's a clip back toward the firewall that holds the back of the harness onto a post. Just going to slide that clip back and then raise it up off of that post. There's a similar clip like that holding it on the driver's side, way down in here, down by the exhaust manifold. You can see it right there. There it comes. I want to relieve some tension on this part of the wiring harness, so I think I'm going to remove this bracket that's holding on the wire that goes down to these two sensors. Now I'd like to disconnect these two sensors. There's one right here next to the oil filter. The other one's tougher to see. It's down here right below the thermostat housing, next to the main flywheel pulley. It's right there with the red wire on it. I'm going to loosen the dipstick tube to see if I can hopefully get that wire out from behind it. So I went ahead and removed the dipstick tube. I'm going to have to clean that off and be careful not to drop any junk down into the oil pan. Now I can finally fish out those wires. But there it goes. Now with that loose, I got some better options. I can hold this up and out of the way, whichever direction I can sneak under or around it. So before we can remove the back part of the timing belt cover, we need to remove the camshaft position sensor. I'll just let that dangle for now. And put the bolt back for safekeeping. And now we can remove the back part of the timing belt cover, 6 bolts, and holding it on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it appears that I'm missing the 6th one down here. I don't know whatever happened to that. Those guys are all the same. Now there's a clip here that holds the wire to the camshaft position sensor. So I was able to disconnect this electrical connector so that the camshaft position sensor could just stay attached to the timing belt cover. Next on the list in the service manual is to remove this, and that is the fuel pressure regulator. It's held on to the back of the fuel rail here with two bolts. It's a small electrical connector back in here, and I need to pull that off because it's holding part of that wiring harness to a sensor of some sort back there. So now we need to remove the high pressure fuel line from the fuel rail. The high pressure fuel line comes up into the engine bay here through this to this flexible hose that runs around the back of the engine. It attaches to the manifold with a bracket held on by that bolt right down in there. And then it comes over here and attaches to the back of the fuel rail right there with that fitting. So I'm going to remove that fitting first. Now that the fuel line is loose, I'm going to remove this bracket that's holding it to the back of the intake manifold. Now I can get the fuel line out of here. Get that up here out of the way, along with the fuel return line and its fuel pressure regulator. So this, I believe, is called the intake manifold stay. It's held on by 2 bolts, a little metal bracket that spans that distance. Coming up on the next major step, and that's to remove this center portion of the intake manifold off the top of the engine and off the top of the heads. But there's a whole bunch of debris down in here, and I don't want any of that to fall down into the engine and make matters worse. So I'm going to blow all that out with compressed air, but before I do, I'm going to stick some rags in these intake ports, trying to keep the debris to a minimum as I blow it out with compressed air. Looks like we have one more electrical connector to remove. Missed that one earlier. And now we have a series of 4 nuts, 2 on the front corners and 2 on the rear corners, and then 8 bolts, 4 along each side. And a washer under each one of these nuts. Now for the 8 bolts. I'm going to loosen them in stages. Like each one of these have a small washer and a large washer on it. You might have noticed I've been using a wobble extension on these things. It's kind of cool because it's kind of rounded. But rather than using a universal joint to get a little bit more room. So just a quick look at these nuts and bolts as they came out, because it's probably important that they are different lengths. And it's interesting how they alternate, the longer ones like this and the shorter ones like this. A little bit concerning is these front 2 bolts, kind of rusty looking toward the bottom of the threads. So I don't know what we got going on down in there, but I've had a rusty coolant issue for a long time, ever since I bought the truck. But it's old. We'll see what happens when we get into it. Alright, let's see if we can get this thing carefully off of here. First thing I can see is this heater hose is still connected. I'll have to remove that hose clamp. Now this guy should come on out of here. It looks like we'll definitely be needing some new gaskets in here. It's kind of deteriorated right here. This is kind of chipped off. So that's no problem. I think that's pretty much required anyway. Looking more closely down in here, looks like down inside of there, that's not inside the engine, that's just between the manifold, or under the manifold, there's some pools of green coolant. See it down in there? There's one, there's a reflection of the light on that. Got some coolant leak down in there. I don't know if it's because it just leaked past these gaskets. These are cooling passages. You can see they're a little rusty. So hopefully it's just a problem with these gaskets where that water and coolant got down on top of the engine like that. The alternator bracket is held on to the driver's side head, so we need to remove that. It's held on by, I think, at least 2 bolts here and one below it. Obviously there's another one holding it on. Yes, there is a 3rd bolt back under there, but it's kind of behind this little shield, so we've got to remove that little shield first. Now we should be able to get to the last bolt holding this bracket on. And there's our alternator bracket. My collection of parts sure is growing. So let's move on to some of the exhaust components. Here on this exploded diagram you can see the left-hand exhaust manifold that normally attaches to the head on the left side of the engine here. On the back of the engine toward the firewall is the exhaust crossover pipe, and it attaches with a gasket to the end of the left-hand exhaust manifold. So here's another view of the back of the engine as it faces the firewall in this direction. There's the exhaust crossover pipe on the back, and it attaches to the left-hand exhaust manifold here with 3 nuts on studs. So those are the 3 nuts that we're going to try to get off now. So here on the left-hand side of the engine, you can clearly see the exhaust manifold here with this heat shield on the outside of it. Back here is that exhaust crossover pipe with a heat shield on it as well, and a flange here that attaches it to the exhaust manifold. There's one of these studs and a nut on it. There's another one on the top right here. You can just barely see it. And there's one directly below. We'll look at that one in a few minutes from the bottom when we get underneath the truck. So let's see what we can do with these 2 nuts and see if they'll budge. So I'm going to put my 14mm wrench on there and sneak another wrench on top for leverage. It's moving just a little bit. Okay. Yeah. I'm surprised. I don't like exhaust work because it's usually rusted nuts and bolts and everything's frozen together. Looks like I'm going to need to use a cheater bar on my ratchet handle just to give me a little bit more leverage. So we're underneath the truck now, and we're pretty much right underneath the driver's floorboard, about where the pedals are. And you can see that flange and the lower bolt. It's way up in there, kind of in a funny angle. I'm going to try with a long extension and a universal joint. Alright, so that wasn't so bad. As you can see, it looks like we've got separation now between that back crossover pipe and this left-hand exhaust manifold. See, I can pull it apart just a little bit.